The books were given to us by Bishop John Parkhurst, who was an old boy of the school. He wasn't actually here very long, but he obviously kept an affection for his old school. When he left here, he went to Oxford, and while he was in Oxford, Henry VIII came through with his wife, Catherine Parr. Parkhurst was quite taken by Henry and his wife, and he wrote some Latin verses in Catherine Parr's honour, gave them to Henry VIII, and Henry liked these, and to cut a long story short, Parkhurst became Catherine Parr's chaplain, and he was her chaplain for many years after Henry died. When he was a very strong Protestant, and when Mary Tudor became Queen, he went to Switzerland. I like to think of him as fleeing, but that's probably romantic nonsense. He went to Switzerland anyway, he went to Geneva, which was at the time a very important centre of book production, as well as a very much a stronghold of Protestantism. While he was there, he bought a lot of books. And when Elizabeth became Queen, she invited him back to become Bishop of Norwich. And one would expect that he would have brought a lot of his books with him, but apparently a lot of them got lost on the way, or what have you. Anyway, he bought a lot more books when he got to, they didn't all arrive in Norwich, and he continued to buy a lot more books after he arrived back in England, and right up to his death. When he died, he left all of his books that were not in English to the school and the people of Guildford to be housed in the school. But at that time, books were incredibly valuable. I mean, it's difficult to stress how valuable they were, really, because almost nobody had them. And quite understandably, the people in Norwich didn't want to part with them. He died in 1575. We didn't get the books until 1583. The mayor of Guildford was fighting a legal battle all that time to get his hands on them. Eventually, he had to go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer to force the people in Norwich to give us the books. And even then, it's said the then bishop kept all the best ones for himself. Now, the main reason why the library is so well known, I guess, is these chains. It's very unusual to have chains on books that are as old as this, on printed books, because these are all printed books. It's very unusual to have books that are as young as this, chained. We normally associate chains with manuscripts. But libraries were very rare. There were almost no town libraries at that time. In fact, this is one of the oldest town libraries still in existence. And I guess the people, the mayor, they'd had such a difficult time getting the books that they wanted to make sure they hung on to them, and these obviously were for security. Now, the chains are genuine, and the books are genuine, but the chains are not necessarily on the same books as they were originally, because the books have led a very, very checkered life. Now, the other thing that, especially the children who come to see the library, always remark on, is that the books are on the wrong way around. That is because, well, partly because it's easier for the chains, but also because people didn't write on the spines of books in the way, they didn't put the titles on the spines of books in the way that we do now. If you wanted to say what a book was, you wrote it in ink on the papers, the papers at the front here. And this is, most of them are not on here anymore, but this is one that's still there. And I can show you a picture of what books looked like. I mean, basically, most people didn't have enough books. Anybody who had any books at all would only have one or two, and they didn't need to have titles. But there's a very fine example here of a scholar with a collection of books, and you can see how they're stacked on the shelf, and they're written on this outer side. Now, to the books. This is the oldest one in the collection. It's Diomedes De Arte Grammatica, and it's an extremely interesting book. not just because it's the oldest one in the collection. It dates from 1480, printed by a man called Jensen in Venice. Or rather, I say that, the first half, the front of the book, was printed in Venice by a man called Jensen. And one of the reasons why it's interesting is because it's actually two books bound into one. When you bought a book in those days, you didn't buy it off the shelf ready bound. You bought huge sheets of paper, gave them to your binder, who cut them and bound them for you, and they would be bound. You would have your own binding, and so that when your books were displayed, they all looked the same. They were recognisably yours. This was obviously bought second-hand, but it's two books in one. It's interesting partly because the papers that were here are missing, and so you can actually see the binding itself. And this is good solid wood, and you can see the way it's been stitched in. But it's also interesting because this front half, as I said, was printed in Venice. The back half, the other book, was printed in Cologne. And I think you can see very clearly there that the writing is very different. Now, Cologne, Germany, where of course the printing press was invented in Germany, this writing looks like manuscript. And that was obviously the model that the earliest printers used for their printing was manuscript. But this book is entirely different. And it looks, from a distance, it could easily be a very modern book, and it looks indeed not unlike Times New Roman on your computer. This was, as I say, done in Venice at the height of the Renaissance, and this script is based on Roman lettering. And I think it's interesting that you get the two different sorts of lettering very early on in the same volume, and you have almost encapsulated the beginning of printing as we know it there. So that books that were printed before 1500 are so special and so rare that they have a special name. They're called incunabula. We've got three of them here. There's this one and these two as well. This book is, again, a fascinating book, and the only book in the library that has any real illustration in it, coloured illustration in it. It's has this wonderful page, which I think is very interesting. It's sort of the first page of the section, and down the sides here you have these. You can see quite clearly these are blocks that have been printed, a bit like wood blocks, a bit like how you used to do potato prints when you were in primary school. You can see the lines of the blocks. All the letters are the same thickness. They're quite crude, really, and it's quite difficult to read. This lady here is actually juggling, but you have to look very closely indeed to pick out the balls from the decoration in the back, because it's all absolutely the same. But when we look at this letter here, this was done by hand, and therefore it's a useful page for, if you don't very often see old books like this, it's a useful page to be able to see the difference between a printed pattern, design, picture, whatever you want to call it at the time, and one that had been done by hand. The lines here are very much finer, there's much more gradation of line, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I really, probably my favourite page in the whole library. But there are other marks in it as well. Some poor soul, probably an apprentice, had to go all the way through, and there are all these blue and red marks for paragraph marks. And there is this lovely, lovely illuminated letter right at the beginning. It's very, very beautiful. And then this is the other incunabulum. Again, this was printed in Venice. There aren't very many books that are printed in Venice, which is unusual because there were a lot of books being printed in Venice at the same time. But also, it's the only book of the earlier ones that you could sort of describe as secular. It's not properly secular because it's an astrological, astronomical, mathematical book, which of course was very important to the church at that time, so it was used for religious purposes as well, but it's the closest we come to a secular book. And it has this lovely illustration in the front, and it's written by a man called Johannes Regiomontanus. It was called that because he came from Königsberg, and Königsberg and Regiomontanus, German, Latin, same thing. Here he is in the book chatting to Ptolemy, sitting underneath a Ptolemaic system of the world. Quite nice. So he's putting himself on a par with Ptolemy here, which is quite something really. And then you have these lovely illustrated, letters at the beginning of the sections, and then all the way through are these characters, these mathematical marks, drawings about the movements of the stars, which is very pretty, and some writing in the margin. Now, trying to do this in a date order, roughly speaking, this book was printed in 1516, and it's probably one of the rarest books in the collection. Unfortunately, it's in a very sorry state, and it has been like this for quite some time, and so I can't actually open it up and show you inside, but this is what happens to a book when it gets very old, and it's not looked after quite as well as it might have been. At some time in the past, it's got very wet. This is not wet water damage from the fire. It's from long before that. At some point it's either got very wet or it's been eaten away. And but it's by Hilary. It's the works of Hilary of Poitiers, and there aren't very many copies of this left around. There's a nice picture of a printing press in the front. This is something that I always think is very exciting. You see this in the book. If it was really what it said it was, but what this says it is, I wouldn't be showing it to you like this now, because this is William Caxton's mark. Unfortunately, perhaps for the school, it's not a William Caxton book. If it was, it would be priceless. But it was printed on William Caxton's press after he died by incunabula, who was the man who took over the press, and he was a different sort of character to Caxton. He made the press much larger. He printed many more books. Perhaps partly as a consequence they're not so valuable. But it has got this very interesting page in the front, and it has been said that this page is actually from a real Caxton book, it's an original plate of Caxton's, and it's thought that it's an illustration from a book called The Golden Legend, which was very, very famous, big bestseller throughout the Middle Ages and up to Tudor times, and you can still buy it in Penguin, and there's black classics in Penguin, you can still buy it. And it was all the gory stories of how the saints died, in glorious technicolor, probably. This one's black and white, but they're very obviously not English saints, and this book is a book about English saints. It's I think the first book that was written. It's by a man called John Capgrave, and I think it's the first book that was written for printing about English saints, and there are the sort of people you'd expect in here, Edward the Confessor, and people like that, and some, like Bertolino, Hermit and Confessor, and all sorts of other people that I've certainly never heard of. But Venerable Bede is here, and various other people. But it's a very nice book, and again, it has these lovely little decorations at the beginning of the chapters, and some of them have lovely faces on, a bit like gargoyle faces. They're very pretty. Now, this book dates from 1604, but as I'm standing here, I'll show you this one now. This is probably one of the first gifts to the library. Once everyone knew that we had all of these books, and we started getting them, they started giving us more books. And this one was given to us by the Austin family. Now, the Austins were very, very important in the history of the library. It was John Austin who fought the battle with the bishops of Norwich, the people in Norwich, to get the books in the first place. And he catalogued all of the books. All of the books have, I can show you one of his cataloguing marks on here. All of the books that were part of the Parkhurst bequest have his cataloguing mark here. And this was given by the Austen family, and it says on the front, gift of John Austen, merchant adventurer. I think that's very exciting, merchant adventurer. But in fact, it's rather boring in reality. It was one of the big guilds, and it means he was a businessman basically, albeit a wealthy one. And he had been a member of Parliament for this area and mayor. And this actual plate on which this is written is quite rare now. They were very common at the time, but most of them are broken, fallen off books and so forth. They're made of whalebone. And remember earlier I was saying that people didn't put titles on the back. If you wanted to make a mark on a book, this is how you did it. You used whalebone to and stuck it on the front within a sort of little metal frame. Now, this binding is a very rich, expensive one. These big bosses here. There are lots and lots of different stamps. Most of the books' bindings, they have one or two stamps that are used lots of times. But this one is actually lots and lots of different stamps. And I think this book is saying, they wanted to give a gift that really looked expensive because they wanted the family to be remembered in terms of the library. And it also has this lovely clasp which has seen better days. Lots of the books would have had those clasps, but this one is about the only one I think that's left. And it is interesting that this is the only book that's got the clasp, that has got the whalebone plate, and therefore it's possibly one that has been looked after a little bit better than the others in the distant past because people recognised it as important. Now for what's inside it. It's a Bible, and being a Hebrew Bible, it goes from the back, works from the back to the front. The Old Testament does anyway. And you have the Hebrew and the Latin. And then if we come to the front, where we have the New Testament, it's written in, the New Testament starts at the front properly, as one would in a normal book, and it's written in Greek and in Latin. New Testament Greek, that is, I presume. Now, I just want to show you this book while we're over here, because we were talking about the binding. This is one of Parkhurst's original bindings. You see there are a few stamps, but mainly the same one in the middle. And this is interesting because what's in the back? This is a manuscript, and lots of the books have these in the back, or some of them, a lot of them, the better ones have been taken out now. But what happened when they were binding books, especially Parkhurst's books, which were bound in East Anglia, in Norwich, when he came back, there had been lots of monasteries in East Anglia, therefore lots of manuscript libraries. But these had all been these were all taken over by at the time of the Reformation. The monasteries were destroyed. There was lots of manuscripts swinging around, which was not only no longer fashionable but also Catholic, and it was used as scrap paper. So we've got evidence of lots of different manuscripts and things in the back of the backs of the books, and some of them proved very interesting to scholars. There's one man who came all the way from Philadelphia to see one of the manuscripts that had been in the back of one of our books, because he was doing research on the book that it had come from. I always like to show this little book, because it must be the smallest book in the collection. And it's written by George Abbott, whose hospital is just down the road. And it's George Abbott's brief description of the whole world. So it's certainly brief because it's in this tiny little book. There's a rather nice little picture in the front. George Abbott looking down on the world. And I think he probably wrote it because he came to live in Abbott's Hospital after he retired. I can't absolutely say for certain. But I like to think of him sitting just down the road and writing this book before it was published. I think it's rather a nice little book. Now, we move on spell to this, which is the first volume of a polyglot Bible. This is the book that has a picture on the front of a man, a scholar with a library that I mentioned earlier, and it's Brianus Walternus who compiled this. And it is an extraordinary work. Before I came here, I'd never seen one of these, and I think it's absolutely amazing. We turn just to Genesis. On this page, this is so that if you were a scholar and you weren't absolutely sure of the translation, the way in which the Bible had been translated in the version that you have, you could check all the different languages, because on this page we have, all the notes are from the Vulgate, but we have Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Chaldaic, which presumably was the language that Abraham spoke, Abraham of the Chaldees, and then 2 versions of Samaritan. And I was particularly fascinated by this because until I came here and saw this book, I didn't know that there was such a language as Samaritan. And apparently, Samaritan is a corruption of Sumerian, because the Samaritans were originally refugees from Sumeria, came to settle in the Holy Land, and they brought their own language with them. And if you look at this, it's a form of cuneiform, which I find quite exciting to see that this is a 17th century book which has got texts in cuneiform. It's quite exciting. And if you look at different parts of the... different parts of the Bible have different translations, different languages that they're in, and there are about 6 volumes down there, and they also have Persian and quite a few other languages anyway there. And now to really modern times, to England. This book is again was a gift to the library, and this is Newton's Principles of Natural Philosophy, which was translated, because remember Newton was originally writing in Latin, as all scholars were in this time. It was translated by a man called Robert Thorpe, and it's a sort of layman's Principia for ordinary people to read, with notes. I have to say that I certainly wouldn't be reading it. It's pretty testing stuff, and it has some interesting sort of fold-outs of the maths. I remember Mr. Thorne coming once to have a look at this. He was extremely interested in it. Not like bedtime reading, I don't think. But the other thing that's interesting about it is it was presented to us by one of the Onslows. The Onslows have always been associated with the school. The current Lord Onslow is the current governor, and this was presented by G. Onslow, George presumably, in 1776. And he says that he's giving it to the school because his wife's brother, the Reverend Thorpe, was the man who did it, and he wants to support his brother-in-law, but also because every good library should have one. So that's that. This, I always like to show this last. I always like to show it. This is, I think, a beautiful book. People are still producing books in the old way, on handmade paper, on hand presses, and there is quite a specialist market. They do still exist. And this book was produced, illustrated, printed. I don't think he made the paper, but everything else he did, by someone called Ronald King, who is very well known in this world. He's also well known. He makes sort of cut out alphabets and things as well, for which he's particularly known. And his son was at the school, and while he was here, he died of leukemia. And Ronald King presented this to the school in memory of his son who died. So I think it's always important for us to look at it and remember his son. But the illustrations are beautiful, really brightly coloured, and they were the illustrations were also sold as individual prints, and they're illustrating the prologue, Chaucer's prologue. This is the squire and the nun, etc.